Today, we are strapping in for a really high-velocity look at power, finance, and the spectacular collision of both.
We're giving you a look inside conversations that were absolutely 100% meant to stay behind closed doors.
That's right. Our subject today is the electrifying and I think very controversial account by Yanis Varoufakis.
He's the world-renowned economist who served as Greece's finance minister for, just 5 months during that insane period in 2015. And the book, of course, is Adults in the Room.
Yeah, and those 5 months, they encompassed one of the most critical and frankly tense political battles in modern European history.
The whole book details his attempt to fundamentally renegotiate Greece's debt, which he saw as completely unsustainable, a kind of toxic trap.
And it also details the utterly furious reaction from Europe's dominant political, financial, and media elite. That group that's often just called the Troika.
So our mission in this deep dive is to give you a comprehensive shortcut. We're going to be extracting the absolute key insights, the technical definitions, and really the structural understanding of this pivotal moment, chapter by chapter.
We'll be exposing the hidden agendas, the internal machinations that, in his telling, led to the crushing of the so-called Athens Spring.
And what that meant for democracy across the entire continent.
Yeah.
This is way more than just an accounting of debt. It's a structural analysis of how power actually operates today.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the foundational challenge Varoufakis faced, which kind of introduces his whole philosophy of resistance.
Right. So this first chapter really sets the stage with the defining ethical dilemma of his entire time in office. He calls it the insider-outsider test.
And this happens almost immediately, right? Just after the election that swept his party, Syriza, into power.
Yeah. He finds himself in Washington, D.C. In a late-night meeting with the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers.
Larry Summers? If you're looking for the definition of a political establishment figure, that's your guy.
The ultimate insider. And Summers poses this question, this probing question, that anyone challenging a major system eventually has to face.
He asks him basically, are you prepared to be an insider? Right. Are you ready to play by the rules of the very system you were just elected to fight?
And this was such a critical moment. It really defined his whole trajectory. Varoufakis was, he was keenly aware that real reform rarely comes from the center of power.
But he knew he had to operate in that world.
Exactly. He understood the practical necessities.
Yeah.
So his response was, it was nuanced. He said he was prepared to act like a natural insider for as long as it took to get a viable, sustainable deal for Greece.
A deal that would actually release people from what he called debt prison.
Right. But, and this is the key part, he made it crystal clear that he was ready to turn whistleblower, to go right back to being an outsider if the price of admission was Greece's eternal debt bondage.
He immediately connects this whole challenge, this opacity, to a concept he calls black boxes of power.
It's a term he borrows from an art installation by his partner, Denis Stratu, and it's a powerful metaphor.
So what are these black boxes?
They're the networks that operate through exclusion and a complete lack of transparency. Varoufakis describes them as conspiracies without conspirators.
Meaning it's not one person pulling the strings?
No, not at all. They function because everyone inside the system just accepts the rules, the operational parameters that shield them from any kind of democratic accountability.
So Summers believed you can only make the world better from inside this sealed box.
Yeah, but Varoufakis had this sense, this feeling that the box was actively poisoning everything on the outside.
And to really understand the stakes of fighting this opaque system, he goes back to the people, to that art project.
He does. Denis' project asked Athenians what they feared losing the most. And the word they chose wasn't money or jobs.
It was dignity.
Dignity. The loss of dignity was absolutely central to the movement that elected him. Varoufakis highlights the severe human cost of this crisis.
He talks about the tragic rise in suicides in places like Crete, right? An island known for its fierce pride.
Yeah. And this idea of a moral cost of fighting for human dignity, it informs his personal, unwavering refusal to sign any document that simply extends this debt trap.
Which brings us to the central pressure point of his job. The Greek finance minister was the one person whose signature was required on all the bailout documents.
And he explains his resolve, his refusal to sign, with two really powerful and deeply personal stories.
The first one is about his father.
Yeah, his father, Yorgos. Back in 1946, Yorgos refused to sign a false apology to the secret police. He chose prison over compromising his moral integrity.
So it's this inherited, deeply felt refusal to trade dignity for, like, temporary relief.
Exactly. And the second anecdote is, it's just heartbreaking. It's contemporary. It's about a man named Lambros.
The translator.
The highly educated translator Varoufakis met, who would become homeless. Just a devastating living symbol of the human cost, the waste that these austerity policies were creating. He said it convinced him the system's logic was murderous.
But the most stunning revelation in this chapter, the one that confirmed all his suspicions, was a private conversation he had
with Christine Lagarde, who was the head of the IMF at the time.
This is what he calls the confession.
And it's arguably the most critical piece of information in the entire book. Lagarde, a seasoned political operator, she concedes with what he calls calm and gentle honesty that the austerity policies being forced on Greece couldn't work. She admitted they would not lead to recovery or debt repayment. That was the economic truth. And yet she immediately followed that shocking admission by saying that the program had to continue.
Why?
Because of the massive political investment. Her words were, "We have put too much into this program."
Wow. So the goal wasn't economic health. It wasn't solvency.
Not at all. It was about maintaining the credibility of the institutions and avoiding the admission of a massive political failure.
So it cemented his view that this whole thing was driven not by malice, but by powerful people, the adults in the room,
who were caught in a political and bureaucratic trap of their own making. They were unable to admit defeat because the cost of that admission, the collapse of the whole Franco-German banking sector, was just seen as politically unbearable.
Okay, so if Chapter 1 sets the moral and philosophical stakes, Chapter 2 gets into the really cynical, technical origin of the crisis.
Right. It starts with the 2008 fallout and what he calls the cynical transfer of losses.
You have to understand the core fear back in 2010. The 2008 crisis had left major Northern European banks, especially French and German banks, dangerously exposed to the debt of peripheral countries.
Varoufakis points out that French banks, for example, had exposure that was at least twice the size of the entire French economy.
So if Greece defaulted,
those banks would collapse immediately. And that would force Paris and Berlin into politically suicidal bailouts of their own private financial sectors.
So the Greek bailout, the one we were told was to help Greece,
was actually an immediate life raft for Franco-German banks, just disguised as aid.
That's the cynical transfer.
Precisely. Varoufakis details how the first Greek bailout was conceived so that instead of German and French taxpayers bailing out their own private banks, they arranged for European taxpayers, including the weakest ones, like the Greeks, to bail out those same banks indirectly.
So the money just flowed through Greece and right back out again.
Immediately. It went straight back to the northern banks, leaving Greece holding all the new debt.
And he argues that, compared to the U.S., European banks were just atrociously managed.
Oh, the numbers are startling. He highlights that the exposure of European banks was over $30 trillion.
$30 trillion.
A state-funded bailout for that level of risk would have cost something like $10,000 per citizen in key EU states. In the U.S., after the Wall Street crisis, it was only about $258 per citizen.
So Europe's elites just couldn't admit to that level of negligence.
They didn't have the political capital, so Greece became the necessary scapegoat.
The canary in the Eurozone's coal mine.
Exactly. Greece was systemically scapegoated, blamed for mismanagement, and forced into policies that turned the nation into what Varoufakis called a postmodern workhouse.
And this was all to prevent the continent's monetary system from collapsing under the weight of its own banking failures.
Right, which leads him to define his famous ugly word for this new reality, Bailidistan.
How does he define that?
He calls it the turning of Greece into a debtor's prison on behalf of Northern Europe's banks. The expectation was that Greek citizens wouldn't just bear the burden of these impossible loans,
but that they would internalize the blame.
Yes, that they would accept that their suffering was necessary because of their own national failures, not because of structural European banking malpractice.
But that collective blame game, it failed. It spurred this grassroots reaction he calls the legitimacy crunch.
And that's the spontaneous Syntagma Square protests in 2011. Thousands of people gathering, demanding back the dignity that the bailout had stolen from them. Varoufakis describes it as an agora vibrating with possibility.
And the symbolic turning point was rejecting that blame game.
Totally. The protesters were fighting the narrative that they were uniquely flawed. He tells this story about a woman asking a parliamentarian, "Who do I have to be if the person she was had lost all standing?" That movement is what eventually fueled the rise of Syriza.
Now, Varoufakis wasn't always a minister. He was fighting this battle intellectually long before he ever got elected.
Oh yeah. He details his solitary struggle, starting as early as 2009. His perspective was considered radical at the time.
He was advising the government not to seek the bailout loans at all.
His argument was just pure logic. If you cannot repay the debt, accepting new loans to pay off old ones only deepens the eternal debt bondage. He argued they should just embrace bankruptcy and immediately restructure.
For which he was basically called a traitor.
Immediately labeled a traitor by the establishment. They insisted that kind of talk undermined confidence.
But this stance was tied to his early strategic calculation about Grexit.
Right. He believed that demanding debt restructuring was the only way Greece could remain sustainably inside the Eurozone.
He argued the threat of Grexit, which terrified European officials, was actually an empty one.
Empty for the creditors, because if they actually executed it, it would have destroyed their own Franco-German banks. So Greece had leverage. He believed that staying in the union only to be crushed by it was a pointless and immoral political exercise.
So when he starts advising Alexis Tsipras, the leader of Syriza, he stresses that this determination, this willingness to accept a rupture, was the absolute prerequisite for any kind of success.
Absolutely. When he's advising Tsipras in 2012, he outlines the severe practical risks of Grexit. I mean, the immediate exodus of euros, the fact that you don't have a national currency. Minting a new one takes months. It's a disaster scenario.
So the critical requirement he imposed was ideological.
It had to be. Syriza had to genuinely prefer rupture over capitulation. They had to be ready to walk away, or the creditors would see right through their bluff.
This strategy eventually crystallized into what he called the five-pronged strategy core. It's built on two essential ideas.
Okay, so the first core idea was about breaking what he called the doom loop.
Which was?
He wanted to decouple the state's insolvency, so the public debt, from the bank's private losses. This was critical because the state was guaranteeing the private banks, and the bank's weakness was just dragging the state down further and further.
So by separating them, the state wouldn't be on the hook for money it never even received.
Exactly. And the path to reviving the banks wouldn't be perpetually chained to the state's bankruptcy.
And the second idea was more about systemic stability, not just national ownership.
That's right. He proposed transferring ownership of the Greek banks to European taxpayers. This was a move toward a truly federal European banking system.
His argument was that the Greek state just couldn't prop up its own banks safely inside the euro system.
Right. If Europe wanted stability, Europe needed to own the risk.
And the main tactical instruction, which was often ignored.
He stressed again and again the need to turn down any new loans until the debt was restructured. Accepting more of these extend and pretend loans, which was the lifeblood of the Troika's whole strategy, was fiscally irrational and politically damaging.
It was, as he put it, like accepting a credit card to repay mortgage installments that you cannot make.
Perfect analogy. It just digs the hole deeper.
Okay, so let's move into the period between 2012 and 2014. The conservative Samaras government is in power, and they're trying to create a mirage of recovery through even more austerity.
Yeah, this was the period of the Samaras success story, which was really an attempt to fool voters and, more importantly, the markets.
It was a three-part political plan, right? Designed to secure temporary confidence.
Exactly. First, there was the Merkel boost, which was meant to spark some speculative money flow. Second, they demonstrated hyper-compliance with every single one of the Troika's demands.
And third, and this was the most important part,
they requested the ECB put, basically, guaranteed debt. This would tell investors that their bonds were protected by the European Central Bank, even if Greece collapsed, which would encourage them to buy.
The idea was to convince everyone that Greece was trusted again and that austerity was working, even if the economy was actually still shrinking.
Precisely. But the whole illusion was completely unsustainable. And by 2014, Syriza's gains in the elections made Samaras look ineffective to the Germans.
And Varoufakis details a pretty candid admission he later got about Wolfgang Schäuble's assessment of the situation.
He did. Schäuble had essentially decided to stop politically supporting the Samaras government by June of 2014.
Why?
He just saw Samaras as a lame duck. Crucially, he saw him as ineffective in implementing the kind of deep structural changes the creditors were demanding. The German view was clear. Samaras had lost his political zeal, and therefore he'd lost his utility.
So Varoufakis' core strategy remained the only viable option if Syriza won, and he kept hammering home this one core, non-negotiable condition.
The absolute core condition was non-negotiable. He said Syriza had to believe in their bones that capitulating like Samara's was worse than being thrown out of the euro.
Because there was no point winning power only to fold the moment the creditors turned the screw.
None. The only leverage they had, the only card they could play, was their willingness to rupture the Eurozone structure.
All right, this chapter is a big one. This is the moment the creditors start preparing their almost military-style attack strategy against the incoming Syriza government.
This was the detection of what he calls the ECB trap in June of 2014. The European Central Bank announced that it would stop accepting Greek IOUs as collateral by March 2015.
Which was exactly when a new anti-austerity government was expected to be in power.
Exactly.
Okay, let's pause on this. What does that actually mean, stop accepting IOUs as collateral, and why was it so devastating?
Okay, so when banks need liquidity cash, they normally go to the central bank, the ECB, and they exchange high-quality assets like government bonds or IOUs for that cash. That's the collateral.
So by saying they would stop accepting Greek IOUs,
the ECB was essentially telling all the Greek banks, you are cut off from standard, affordable liquidity. It was an intentionally set financial time bomb.
Designed to accelerate the bank run that was already happening.
It was a clear, purely political attempt to destabilize the incoming government before it even took office.
So sensing this danger, Alexis Tsipras asks Varoufakis to develop a deterrence strategy. This is Plan X.
This contingency planning was absolutely essential, and Varoufakis developed two key components. The first was the key deterrent.
And what was that?
It was a discrete threat. The threat was to postpone the redemption of Greek government bonds that the ECB itself held, these are known as S&P bonds, by 2 decades if the ECB closed the Greek banks.
So why was that such a powerful threat?
Because Draghi, the head of the ECB, was obsessed with launching his big quantitative easing program. Any disruption to that, especially involving bonds the ECB actually owned, was seen as a major point of leverage.
And the second component was more practical. It was a way to keep the economy running if the banks were shut down completely.
That was the parallel payment system. It was a pretty clever scheme using the tax office website and smart cards linked to people's tax ID numbers.
The goal was to allow internal transactions, pensions, wages, payments to suppliers to keep happening during a bank holiday.
Exactly. It would essentially create an internal euro-denominated liquidity system. It would ensure the state could still function, even if the ECB cut off all external banking support.
But even with these solid technical preparations, Varoufakis was dealing with a lot of internal ideological conflict from the very start.
Oh, yeah. He expresses deep discomfort with the populist Thessaloniki program that Syriza was promoting publicly.
He saw it as incoherent.
Totally incoherent, full of impossible promises like huge pension increases, and just fundamentally inconsistent with the tough reality laid out in his 5-pronged strategy. He felt the party faithful were being served a completely different story than what the leadership was discussing in private.
It was setting up the government for an inevitable betrayal of its own base.
Right. And to fight the establishment, he knew he needed a team that understood the system from the inside.
So he assembles this highly non-traditional team.
He brings in experienced professionals, people like Dimitris Mardas, Elena Peronidi, and most importantly, this guy he calls his priceless weapon, Glenn Kim.
Who was Glenn Kim?
He was a former Wall Street and World Bank professional who knew where all the skeletons were buried in global finance. Their presence signaled that Varoufakis was planning to fight the establishment on its own technical turf, which really annoyed the Troika's bureaucrats.
And even before the election, he has his first contact with the enemy, a clear warning shot.
Yeah, these two EU functionaries, Thomas Weiser and Jorg Asmussen, deliver this initial veiled ultimatum. They signal that no new loans would be provided, not even money that was owed under the previous agreement.
So this would lead to liquidity concerns and market tension.
Which was just code for a financial squeeze designed to suffocate the incoming Syriza government and force them to beg for an extension of the existing poisonous bailout.
So Varoufakis wins his personal mandate with a record-breaking 142,000 votes. Massive popular support for his vision. But as soon as he enters government, the troubles start.
Immediately. With the formation of the cabinet, he highlights the grave loss of not having his close academic colleague, Euclid Tsakalotos, installed as the alternate finance minister for negotiations.
Why was that such a big deal?
Euclid initially refused the tax office post and was only later appointed to a foreign affairs role. It was a critical misstep because it meant Varoufakis lacked an immediate, trusted political ally inside the finance ministry itself.
And then, in his inaugural speech, Varoufakis immediately signals a complete philosophical break from the previous government.
He does. He makes this distinction between genuine parsimony and what he called phony austerity.
And his first symbolic act was pure political theater.
He rehired the 300 cleaners who had been summarily dismissed by the previous conservative government. Varoufakis points out he saved many times their wages through other structural cost reductions.
But the creditors immediately saw this as a casus belli, a reason for war.
Instantly. They labeled it backtracking on reforms. It demonstrated that any act of basic humanity or democratic autonomy was going to be treated as an act of war.
And this philosophy led directly to the clash of processes with the Eurogroup president, Jeroen Dijsselbloem.
Varoufakis insisted on two things. First, he would only deal with elected equals, minister to minister. And second, they had to end the humiliating troika process, where these technocrats were dictating policies to elected ministers.
He urged Dijsselbloem to find a new way of working.
And Dijsselbloem responded with just pure rage. He whispered that now famous defining line, "You just killed the troika."
But Varoufakis knew he'd only killed the name, not the power structure.
Right. And given that hostile reception, he knew the threat of Grexit was very real. So he immediately tasks Jamie Galbraith with advancing Plan X.
Secrecy was paramount here.
Absolutely. If public knowledge of Plan X got out, it would have accelerated the bank run and made Grexit a self-fulfilling prophecy. They had to work in total discretion, preparing the operational framework, the parallel payment system, and the financial deterrent, the S&P haircut threat, to be ready the moment the banks were shut down.
Okay, so Varoufakis begins his European tour, and it starts with a genuine surprise when he meets with Paul Thompson of the IMF in Paris.
Yeah, a huge surprise. Varoufakis went in expecting a fight over debt swaps, but Thompson immediately jumps to this radical conclusion that just shocks him.
What did he suggest?
Thompson suggested an immediate annulment of the entire 53 billion euros of debt that Greece still owed to EU member states from the very first bailout in 2010.
That's a position that only the most radical members of his own party held.
Exactly. It was a position from Syriza's left platform. And it confirmed for Varoufakis that at least some influential figures inside the IMF privately recognized the absolute impossibility of the debt structure. It gave him a crucial moment of hope.
Meanwhile, his meeting with George Osborne, the British Chancellor, offered a kind of interesting, ironic comparison.
It did. Osborne, a conservative minister in a sovereign nation, actually showed some sympathy. He appreciated the help he was getting from the Bank of England's quantitative easing, which was keeping the British economy liquid during their austerity.
He understood Varoufakis' dilemma.
He did. Greece was facing a contractionary contraction enforced by a hostile central bank, the ECB. Osborne, on the other hand, had a friendly central bank propping me up while austerity bit. It highlighted the core difference. The UK had sovereignty over its currency. Greece did not.
And crucially, Varoufakis' pitch to the financial community itself seemed to work, at least for a little while.
Oh, his speech to the City of London financiers was a huge success. He proposed these sensible, growth-linked debt swaps, GDP-index bonds that didn't technically clash with ECB rules.
So these were bonds where the repayment schedule would rise or fall based on Greece's economic growth.
Right, which makes them safer for investors and actually sustainable for Greece. And the market response was magnificent. The headline was, "Greek stocks going nuts."
It proved one thing. The financial world preferred his moderate plan for sustainability over the Troika's endless, unrealistic austerity.
But that market success, that political momentum, it proved to be the spark that ignited the creditors' coordinated counterattack.
And it started immediately with the ECB's ultimatum.
Varoufakis meets with Mario Draghi in Frankfurt. He gives him a clear promise: "I will not unilaterally haircut the S&P bonds, provided the ECB does not close the Greek banks."
And Draghi?
He offers these vague assurances. But just hours later, the hammer falls. Draghi withdraws the ECB waiver, cutting Greek banks off from critical liquidity, the very lifeline that was keeping them breathing.
This was the financial execution of the new government.
It was a purely political act. It was designed to punish the new government for daring to seek a sustainable alternative. Varoufakis had kept his end of the bargain, but Draghi immediately intensified the bank run.
It showed the ECB was acting as a political extension of Berlin, not an independent central bank.
And next came the meeting with Wolfgang Schäuble, who immediately enforced this narrative that direct negotiation was impossible.
He just dismissed everything Varoufakis said.
Everything. About debt restructuring, new economic models, all of it. He insisted they address everything back to the institutions, the technocrats of the Troika,
And he made that sarcastic offer of help.
sending 500 German tax officials to Greece. It was a signal that Berlin would not negotiate political terms. They just expected Greece to respect its obligations to the Troika process.
And this pattern of public hostility masking private solidarity was repeated with other leaders too.
Yeah, the conversation with Sigmar Gabriel, the German vice chancellor, was a painful demonstration of this betrayal. In private, Gabriel expressed deep solidarity, calling what was done to Greece sinful.
But then publicly.
In the joint press conference right after, Gabriel completely reversed course. He adopted a hostile, anti-Greek stance. He was anxious to show the public and his coalition partners that he was tough on the periphery. The political cost of challenging Schäuble was just too high.
And despite all this, Varoufakis went into the Eurogroup still maintaining his stance of what he called uncompromising moderation.
His commitment was key. He said he would not derail fiscal targets. He promised to be fiscally responsible. All he demanded was that his sensible proposals, like the growth-linked bonds, be taken seriously. This was his 70% gesture, showing Greece was willing to sacrifice to achieve sustainability and just asking for a reasonable path forward.
Okay, so Varoufakis describes the formal Eurogroup meeting. He emphasizes that despite all the diplomatic formality, it was not a council of equals.
Not at all. He notes that the Eurogroup itself has no legal standing, but it wields this immense power.
And the real power in that room, where was it?
It sat at the ends of the table, with Dijsselbloem, with Thomas Weiser, the immensely powerful chairman of the Eurogroup Working Group, and with the IMF and the ECB. The ministers in the middle were often just filling seats, rubber-stamping decisions that had already been made by the technocrats and by Berlin.
So Varoufakis pushed for immediate short-term financial stability. He requested access to money that Greece was actually already owed.
Yeah, he pushed for the release of 1.9 billion euros in ECB profits from those S&P bonds money he called Greece's own.
His argument was that if the creditors wanted Greece to maintain its repayment schedule to the IMF, they had to lift the liquidity squeeze and let them access these funds.
And the refusal, he said, demonstrated the creditors' willingness to engineer a financial crisis purely for political leverage.
This confrontation immediately led to an escalating liquidity squeeze on the ground.
The stock exchange fell sharply, bank withdrawals accelerated, and the clock just started ticking faster toward a total shutdown.
Which meant they had to do parallel work back in Athens.
Exactly, focusing on regaining some kind of internal sovereignty while fighting the external collapse.
And a crucial part of that internal work was fighting domestic corruption, especially regulating gambling.
Right. They worked hard on hunting tax cheats with new algorithms and regulations, but the focus on the video lottery terminals, the VLTs, was critical.
Why those specifically?
Because these gambling machines were specifically preying on the impoverished and psychologically depressed Greek population. Varoufakis introduced crucial social restrictions, a maximum loss of 60 euros per person per day, and the obligation to type in your tax file number to track losses. It was about stopping the internal looting of the country that was being facilitated by the structural depression.
All right, this chapter focuses on the internal sabotage that followed that conditional agreement on February 20th. This is when Varoufakis was tasked with submitting his list of reforms.
And the betrayal was immediate and structural. Varoufakis' own deputy, a guy named George Chouliarakis, collaborated directly with the European Commission's Declan Costello to reformat his draft list.
Reformatted how?
They used the Troika's preferred, stale language and template. They made sure the list was presented as a continuation of the old order rather than a genuine new proposal. This internal sabotage was a clear sign of the deep disunity and the pro-establishment elements still operating inside the government.
But the real technical trap was sprung during the subsequent Eurogroup teleconference where the list was formally approved.
The institutions immediately made the list irrelevant with a simple verbal statement. They said that the approved list did not substitute the FOU, the full old bailout program.
So the list was just a bureaucratic step.
That's all it was. The institutions immediately made it clear that the full, painful terms of the original bailout program were still legally binding. Wolfgang Schäuble had, without speaking a single word, successfully reimposed all the old terms.
So after all that negotiation, Greece was right back at square one.
And to prevent the immediate closure of the banks, Alexis made the crushing decision to sign the creditor's letter requesting a loan extension.
A letter that was basically a surrender document.
Completely. It was written in full Troika speak, and it committed Greece to a hostile timeline. Alexis was desperate to avoid putting this to Parliament, because it would expose the deep divisions within Syriza and risk rejection, which would trigger an immediate crash.
So Varoufakis took the fall.
Ultimately, yeah. Varoufakis took sole responsibility to sign the letter to buy time, believing, if anyone's going to go down over this, let it be me. This act postponed the rupture, but it locked Greece into the creditors' timetable and their terms.
So with that extension signed, the creditor strategy moves into this crushing phase, just a continuous squeeze and isolation of the negotiating team.
And the strategy had a few key elements post-February 20th. First, a continuous, slow squeezing of liquidity to prevent any kind of recovery. Second, a flat-out refusal to engage in any meaningful discussions about debt restructuring.
And third, and this was crucial, they used political maneuvering to isolate Varoufakis.
Right. They instructed Troika officials not to meet with elected Greek ministers in Athens. They forced this political runaround and undermined Varoufakis' authority by just bypassing him and calling Alexis directly.
And any external lifelines that Greece was looking for were also brutally cut off.
The failure of the Chinese investment lifeline was a powerful example of that. China had promised to buy 1.4 billion euros in T-bills, which would have provided much-needed cash.
But at the last minute.
They bought only 100 million. This drastic failure suggested that the creditors' power, likely Berlin, or the ECB, reached deep into Beijing's financial decisions. It sent a clear signal. No foreign assistance will be permitted to circumvent our control.
Domestically, though, Varoufakis and Nadia Velavani focused on providing real relief through something called the Humanitarian Crisis Bill.
This was effective. Common sense reform aimed at restoring dignity. It included things like prepaid credit cards for 300,000 destitute families.
And critically, it allowed millions of citizens to get back into the formal economy.
By letting them pay minimum installments as low as 20 euros on massive tax arrears. The result was remarkable. Within a month, 700 million euros had been paid into the state coffers by citizens who were striving to leave the purgatory of official bankruptcy.
It proved that the Greek people were willing to pay taxes if the system offered some fairness.
Exactly. But every single proposal for sustainable reform was met with this deliberate obfuscation from the creditors.
Varoufakis describes what he calls the Swedish national anthem routine.
Yeah, from Visor and Draghi. They would repeatedly dismiss the idea that their actions were political. They'd hide behind complex bureaucratic constraints and say, essentially, we can't lift liquidity restrictions because of X, Y, and Z regulation.
They treated his proposals not as solutions, but as distractions.
Which just showed that the political goal, maintaining control over this flawed financial architecture, was far more important to them than any good economic idea.
The pressure just keeps intensifying. We get to the Washington trip over Easter, where Varoufakis directly confronts Christine Lagarde about the IMF payments.
Right. Greece was facing a huge IMF payment of over 460 million euros due on April 9th, and Varoufakis tried to invoke a moratorium.
His argument was that since the IMF had suspended its payments to Greece and the conditions were being renegotiated, repayments should also be suspended.
Makes sense. But Lagarde's response was sharp and politically shrewd. She said if he insisted on a moratorium, she would insist that there were no negotiations over the conditions. It was a clear threat to just end all talks.
So Varoufakis shifts tactics. He uses their private time to expose the structural corruption in Greece that the creditors were implicitly supporting.
This was the moment he laid bare the triangle of sin in Athens. Corrupt bankers, a captive media, and complicit politicians.
And these were the figures who were actively sabotaging the Syriza government because they benefited from the existing corrupt system.
Right. And Varoufakis pointed out that all of this corruption was implicitly funded by the liquidity the ECB was still providing to the Greek banks. He told Lagarde that when the ECB gets into bed with corrupt bankers who are actively undermining democracy, we consider this enemy action.
Her reaction.
He says she was flabbergasted and promised to address Mario Draghi directly. She recognized the political danger of the ECB's behavior.
But despite these private admissions, the U.S. offered no real geopolitical support.
Not at all. The meetings with President Obama and Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary, were deeply disappointing. Obama urged Greece to meet them halfway, even after Varoufakis detailed how Greece had already walked 4/5 of the way.
And Lew just pressured him to submit to Berlin.
Yeah. The U.S. position was clear. They were not going to risk global financial stability or interfere in Berlin's newly solidified sphere of economic influence just to save Greece from German control. The U.S. had basically ceded the battle.
All right, the Riga Eurogroup meeting. This seems to be the stage for the political execution of Varoufakis. This was just pure character assassination.
It was a coordinated, media-fueled campaign. He was systematically labeled a gambler, a time waster, isolated, and an amateur through leaks to the international press.
And Jeroen Dijsselbloem gave these rumors public credence by just refusing to deny them. He let the character assassination stand unchallenged.
But amidst this orchestrated attack, Varoufakis had this crucial private meeting with Schäuble that revealed the true structural nature of Germany's opposition.
It wasn't about the money.
It was never about the money, it was about the currency itself. This was Schäuble's Grexit verdict.
What was it?
Schäuble privately admitted that he believed Greece could not survive in the euro regardless of how it was governed, because the currency was fundamentally flawed without a political union. He'd resigned himself to never getting the money back.
Which confirms that the priority was just maintaining structural control of the Eurozone, even if it meant sacrificing Greece.
Exactly. His deep-seated fear was that a fair deal for Greece would inspire Spain, Portugal, and Italy to demand similar concessions, and that would threaten the entire architecture.
So, following this humiliation, one of his team members, Nicholas Theokorakis, executes this strategic counterstrike to buy some time.
He does. He preemptively walks out of the Eurogroup Working Group teleconference,
stating that negotiations were now elevated to the political level,
which forced the Troika's technical team to leave Athens. This created a small, vital window of opportunity, free from the constant scrutiny and undermining actions of the technocrats. It allowed the Greek team to just breathe and reorganize.
And this chapter ends with that really strange anecdote in Exarchia.
It's so bizarre. It really reveals the inverted political realities of Baludistan. He's confronted by a hooded anarchist gang in this tense neighborhood.
And he manages to disarm their hostility.
How? By revealing that the establishment they opposed was about to vomit me out. Recognizing their shared enemy, the anarchist leader tells him, "Enough now, get on your motorcycle and go home." The gang even briefly acted as his guards to make sure he got out safely.
It's this bizarre moment where his status as a pariah to the establishment actually earned him respect from the anti-establishment fringe.
So as the external pressure peaked, Varoufakis' internal support structure just completely collapsed. It ensured his removal was only a matter of time.
This was the peak of the internal strife. It showed that many people inside Syriza actually preferred capitulation to confrontation.
Oh yeah. Ministers like George Stathakis were publicly declaring that the duo Varoufakis-Theokorakis cannot bring home an agreement. Choulirakis can.
And Nikos Pappas, a close advisor to Tsipras, privately called Varoufakis the anchor holding the government back from a deal.
The focus shifted entirely to finding a more pliant figure to negotiate the inevitable surrender.
So Varoufakis strikes back by trying to demonstrate the intellectual fraud at the heart of the Troika's demands, their flawed economic models.
He exposed what he called the war of the models. The Troika's models were designed to mandate tax rate increases even if the economy was contracting. They enforced austerity regardless of reality.
He describes this absurd simulation.
It's incredible. He asked the model to calculate the revenue impact of raising the VAT rate from 23% to 223%.
And the model showed a massive increase in revenue.
Which is obviously impossible. It showed the models were utterly divorced from real-world economic behavior. They were designed purely to justify preordained austerity targets, not genuine recovery.
But despite the looming catastrophe, the war cabinet, led by Alexis and Dragisakis, continued to block the necessary contingency plans.
These were the final vetoes on the parallel payment system, the key operational tool they needed to buy time or execute Plan X.
So that veto removed all their leverage. It left the Greek government with no operational counter-threat against the ECB's actions.
Right. And Varoufakis says he recognized the end of the illusion. Alexis was now focused entirely on avoiding responsibility. He dreaded an electoral victory more than defeat. Varoufakis realized Alexis was talking himself into crossing his own red lines, ready to prove he was an insider to prevent the system from collapsing.
Which meant surrendering to the Troika's demands.
The surrender was coming.
Okay, by June, Varoufakis is still pushing his N+1 plan, this comprehensive reform package plus debt restructuring, and he makes one final attempt to engage Germany directly.
He meets with Schäuble again. He proposes this joint Greco-German recovery contract, and Schäuble again agrees that the Eurozone is unsustainable and requires a political union.
But he's still firm in his opposition to any immediate debt restructuring.
He is, and he presses his alternative, the timeout or a temporary Grexit, rather than accepting Varoufakis' sustainable plan that might set a precedent for other nations.
And then Schäuble offers this complex, aggressive secret offer to Alexis. It's a masterful piece of political deflection.
It really is. Schäuble suggests that Alexis should raise the timeout option directly with Merkel, but as an accusation.
So he could test her resolve without the Greek government taking the blame for suggesting Grexit.
Exactly. If Merkel accepted, Schäuble would then discuss the huge help, massive debt relief that Germany would offer Greece outside the euro. If Merkel rejected it, Alexis could claim he stood up to the aggressive German finance minister.
The strategy was designed to force Merkel's hand and make Grexit happen, while making sure Germany escaped any of the blame.
And their professional relationship concludes with this powerful, sarcastic symbol of the fight's ultimate trivialization.
The chocolate euros.
Schäuble gives Varoufakis a pile of milk chocolate euros. It signals the eventual worthlessness of the currency they were fighting over and the trivialization of Greece's suffering.
Varoufakis 8-1.
He did, accepting the bitter truth that the fight had become a perverse political game.
The political tension just becomes unbearable. The creditors deliver their final, crushing proposal, which forces Alexis to call a referendum.
A decision that was met with widespread international political disdain. Italy's finance minister, Pier Carlo Padoan, openly questioned how a democracy could expect normal people to understand such complexity.
Which is a perfect example of the establishment's dismissal of democratic sovereignty when it threatens financial control.
Totally. And this political decision was immediately followed by a coordinated plot to make sure Varoufakis would be the scapegoat for the financial collapse that would result.
Governor Sturneras of the central bank refused to chair the Council for Systemic Stability.
Right, forcing Varoufakis to chair the meeting. This meant Varoufakis had to be the one to approve the bank closure and the capital controls.
So he successfully became the unwilling scapegoat for the closure, a label that still persists in some media outlets to this day.
It was a calculated political maneuver designed to protect the governor and shift all the public blame.
And the desperation within the government became so profound, it led to this shocking internal discussion about outright theft.
Yeah, the theft argument. Alexis and other ministers actually entertained the idea of confiscating the 16 billion euro cash stash held by the Bank of Greece money, printed by the ECB, to stuff the ATM.
And Varoufakis argued vehemently against this.
He called it theft. He reminded Alexis that confiscation had no place in the left's arsenal and would instantly alienate any international support they had left.
Yeah.
He reiterated that the only viable solution was the one they kept vetoing, activating the electronic parallel payment system, Plan X.
So the referendum delivers this monumental 61.3% O vote, a massive triumph of democratic will against all this external coercion.
But Varoufakis arrives at the prime minister's residence, Maximos, to find Alexis treating the triumph as a complete disaster.
The scene is heartbreaking. He says Alexis just stared at him and said they had messed up badly.
His fear was that the victory was too divided internally. It created a situation where the government now had a mandate for rupture that it was fundamentally unprepared to actually execute.
So Varoufakis makes his final impassioned plea.
Activate the SMP haircut. Activate the parallel payment system immediately. He argued they had to use the mandate of the Greek people to force a decent deal. This was their last chance for any kind of leverage.
But Alexis rejected Plan X?
He feared it would be a casus belli, an act of war that the government was not ready to commit to. And Varoufakis instantly realized the surrender was inevitable. Alexis had crossed his final red line.
So Varoufakis resigns on July 6th, 2015.
He realized his continued presence would only lend credibility and legitimacy to the hopeless new bailout agreement, the full, crushing capitulation to the Troika's demands. His resignation was his final act of defiance. He refused to sign or legitimize the betrayal of that NO vote.
And the aftermath was predictable. A brutal political war, accusations of treason, a systematic character assassination campaign led by media and political figures across Europe.
And Varoufakis concludes with his final profound warning. The suppression of the Athens Spring was not an isolated event. It was a test case for the war against democracy across Europe.
The crushing of Greek sovereignty, removing a nation's right to choose its own economic path.
It revealed the fundamental authoritarianism of the system. And he argues that this suppression contributed directly to the surge of populist, anti-establishment movements like Brexit and the rise of Trump. It demonstrated that Greece was the lab, and other democracies are the long-term target. #tag outro.
So let's unpack what Adults in the Room fundamentally teaches us. The core conclusion is It's brutal. The Greek crisis was never truly about economics or solvency.
Not at all. It was a conflict between political will and economic logic. And the establishment chose to sacrifice logic and the dignity of millions to maintain a deeply flawed but politically necessary financial architecture.
It's a really sobering testament to the priorities of modern power structures. The system demanded compliance, not solvency.
Right. Varoufakis' struggle revealed that the true cost of the bailout wasn't just financial, paid by taxpayers all over Europe, but the crushing of democratic sovereignty.
The removal of a government's most basic freedom, the ability to choose its own economic destiny based on an electoral mandate.
And the book forces us to reckon with that lasting implication. Varoufakis exposed the system's willingness to engineer financial chaos just to enforce political submission.
Which leaves us with the provocative thought for you to carry forward. If a government cannot choose its own economic path, if it's forced to betray its electoral mandate or face financial execution, is the union worth saving?
And if the financial establishment has established Bailoudistan as a means of structural control, what is the next battleground for dignity in Europe?